What's the most expensive wedding disaster that could have been avoided with a contract? Story 1. My cousin planned a massive destination wedding in Italy. Everything was set, five-star venue, Michelin-starred catering, and a live band flown in from the States. The only problem? She didn't have a contract with her wedding. They'd been working together for months, but all the agreements were made over email and text. 3 weeks before the wedding, the planner disappeared. No responses, no explanations. Turns out, she had taken deposits from multiple clients and skipped town. My cousin had already wired her $50,000 up front, and since there was no official contract, there was no legal recourse to get it back. With guests already booking flights and accommodations, she had to scramble and hire a new planner last minute, who charged almost double because of the short notice. The wedding still happened, but she spent an extra $80,000 fixing the disaster. Had she signed a contract, she could have at least sued for damages, or never hired that scam artist in the first place. Story 2. My friend's wedding was a high-end affair with a $20,000 photography package. The photographer was well-reviewed, so they didn't think twice about skipping a formal contract, just a deposit and a handshake deal. Big mistake. The day of the wedding, the photographer showed up late, missed key shots, and acted completely unprofessional. To make it worse, they ghosted the couple for months after the wedding, refusing to send the photos. When they finally got the pictures, they were blurry, overexposed, and looked like they were taken with a disposable camera. With no contract specifying deliverables, turnaround time, or refund policies, my friend had no legal ground to demand a refund or even get high-quality re-edits. They ended up spending another $15,000 to hire a new photographer for a post-wedding shoot just to have decent pictures. Story 3. This happened to my coworker's brother. They booked a stunning venue that cost over $60,000. The couple signed a basic agreement, but they didn't include a clause about exclusivity. They just assumed they'd have the place to themselves. On the wedding day, they arrived to find another wedding taking place in the ballroom next door. Not a small, intimate ceremony, an over-the-top, fireworks and live band kind of wedding. The noise was so bad that my coworker's brother and his wife could barely hear their vows. Their reception was drowned out by the other party's music. The venue refused to give a refund, arguing that the contract never stated exclusivity. The couple ended up suing, but legal fees ate up a chunk of their savings. In the end, they lost $40,000 and a dream wedding, all because they didn't clarify a simple clause. Story 4. My aunt's wedding was a disaster because of one thing: the catering. She paid a high-end catering company $35,000 for a gourmet dining experience, but the contract didn't specify food substitutions or refund policies. The day of the wedding, half the menu was different from what they ordered. Instead of filet mignon, they got tough, overcooked sirloin. Instead of fresh seafood, they served frozen shrimp cocktail. Even the cake was wrong. It was supposed to be a 3-tier masterpiece, but they got a small lopsided cake that looked like a grocery store knockoff. The catering company blamed supply chain issues and refused to offer a refund. Since there was no contract clause covering substitutions, my aunt had no legal claim. She ended up spending another $10,000 on last-minute food orders just to feed the guests. Story 5. A couple I knew had a nightmare DJ situation. They paid $8,000 for a top-tier DJ, but they didn't include a performance clause in the contract. On the wedding night, the DJ showed up drunk. He played the wrong entrance song, ignored the couple's playlist, and even made inappropriate jokes over the mic. Guests were uncomfortable, the bride was crying, and the whole reception felt like a bad high school party. When they demanded a refund, the DJ pointed out that there was no performance clause stating that he had to follow their playlist or conduct himself professionally. They had no case, lost their money, and their wedding night was forever tainted. Story 6. A close friend of mine had a $120,000 wedding planned at a luxury vineyard. Everything was booked, from a high-end caterer to an exclusive designer for the bride's dress. They even splurged on a full wedding weekend package, including a rehearsal dinner and a farewell brunch. The only problem? They never got wedding insurance. A week before the wedding, a wildfire broke out near the vineyard. The venue was forced to shut down due to safety concerns. The couple assumed they'd get a refund since they never actually used the space. But the venue pointed to a tiny clause in the contract: no refunds for acts of God unless they had event insurance. They lost every penny. The caterer, the florist, the band, none of them were contractually obligated to return the money. Their only option was to start over from scratch, but at that point, they were drained financially and emotionally. If they'd paid the $400 for event insurance, they could have recovered almost everything. Instead, they walked away with nothing but regret. Story 7. My cousin's wedding was supposed to be a fairy tale. They booked an extravagant castle venue, complete with horse-drawn carriages, a fireworks show, and a celebrity chef catering the event. The entire thing cost well over $200,000. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't put a backup plan in the contract. On the day of the wedding, a massive storm rolled in. The outdoor ceremony was a washout, and since the venue didn't have an indoor option written into the agreement, they were forced to make do with a cramped backup tent. The fireworks were canceled, the carriages couldn't be used on the flooded grounds, and the caterer bailed at the last minute because his team couldn't transport the food safely. With no contract clauses protecting their investments, they lost over $80,000 in non-refundable costs. The wedding went on, but it was a shell of what they had envisioned. Had they insisted on an ironclad contingency plan in their contract, they could have saved tens of thousands and avoided one of the most expensive disappointments of their lives. Story 8. A friend of mine learned the hard way why you always need a contract for vendor services. She hired a highly recommended makeup artist for her wedding day. No official paperwork, just a deposit sent via Venmo and some texts confirming the date. On the morning of the wedding, the makeup artist was a no-show. My friend frantically called and messaged, but nothing. Finally, 2 hours before the ceremony, the artist sent a casual text. "Sorry, I got double booked. Hope you can find someone else." At that point, it was too late to book another professional. My friend and her bridesmaids had to rush their makeup, borrowing products from each other. The bride, who had paid $2,000 for a flawless wedding look, walked down the aisle with uneven foundation and smudged eyeliner. Since there was no contract, there was nothing she could do. The makeup artist kept the deposit, blocked her on social media, and continued booking other weddings. A simple contract with a cancellation clause would have saved her both money and stress. Story 9. One of the biggest wedding disasters I've ever heard involved my boss's son. They booked a private island resort for the wedding, spending nearly $500,000 on an exclusive experience for their guests. Since the venue was so remote, they had to fly in vendors, musicians, and even some of the decor. What they didn't do? Secure a catering contract that guaranteed food delivery. A week before the wedding, the catering company called to say they couldn't get certain fresh ingredients due to shipping delays. They suggested substituting the gourmet menu with lower-quality pre-packaged options. The couple refused, thinking they could find another vendor last minute. But on a private island, options were limited. The wedding weekend arrived, and the guests were served cold sandwiches, frozen shrimp, and boxed wine. The couple had paid over $100,000 for a luxury dining experience and ended up with a glorified picnic. Since the contract didn't specify quality standards or delivery guarantees, they had no legal case to get their money back. The worst part? A simple clause outlining refund terms or backup catering options could have prevented the entire fiasco. Story 10. This happened to my friend's sister and I still can't believe it. She and her fiancé booked a high-end videographer for their wedding. $15,000 for a cinematic movie-style wedding film. The videographer's portfolio was incredible, so they didn't hesitate to pay in full up front. Fast forward to the wedding day. The videographer showed up, filmed everything beautifully, and promised a stunning final edit within 12 weeks. But when the deadline came, nothing. The couple sent emails, made phone calls, no response. Months passed. They finally tracked the videographer down through mutual friends, only to discover the worst possible news. He had lost all the footage. Every single file was corrupted. Their vows, their first dance, their entire wedding day, gone forever. They tried to sue, but since their contract didn't include a clause for data security or refunds in case of lost footage, they were out of luck. No money back, no video, just a devastating loss. If they had insisted on a contract with liability clauses, they could have at least been compensated for the nightmare. Instead, they paid $15,000 for nothing but disappointment. Story 11. A former coworker of mine had a nightmare wedding because of one simple mistake: no written contract with their DJ. They hired a guy who came highly recommended through a friend, and since he was offering a friend discount, they skipped the formal paperwork and paid him up front. Biggest mistake ever. The wedding day comes, and the DJ is a no-show. Completely ghosted them. No calls, no texts, just gone. Turns out, he had taken a better-paying gig at another wedding and never even planned to show up. Since there was no contract, there was no way to hold him accountable. The couple had to rely on a friend's Spotify playlist connected to some cheap rented speakers. No introductions, no smooth transitions, just a random shuffle of songs that cut off every time an ad played, because of course no one had a premium account. It ruined the reception's vibe, and the couple was out $3,000 with no way to get it back. Lesson learned: always, always have a contract. Story 12. My aunt's wedding disaster still haunts my family to this day. They booked an absolutely breathtaking mountaintop lodge for the wedding, with a contract that outlined the costs. But here's where it went horribly wrong. It didn't specify who was responsible for securing transportation to the venue. Day of the wedding, guests are arriving in shuttles and everything seems fine, until the drivers suddenly refuse to make the final stretch up the steep mountain road, claiming it's too dangerous. The lodge insisted that the couple was responsible for transportation logistics. The couple thought the venue had it covered. Complete disaster. Half the guests were stranded at the base of the mountain, including the groom's elderly grandparents. After hours of scrambling, some guests had to hike the last half mile in dress shoes, while others left in frustration. The ceremony started 3 hours late, and by the time dinner was served, most of the guests were exhausted and over it. The couple ended up spending thousands on emergency last-minute jeeps to transport people up the mountain. And worst of all, their wedding memories were clouded by the chaos. All of it could have been avoided with one clear contract clause about transportation. Story 13. My best friend had the wedding of her dreams, until she found out she was being scammed by her own wedding planner. This planner was a high-end professional with an impressive portfolio. My friend trusted her so much that she gave her full financial control over vendor payments. But what my friend didn't realize was that the planner had been inflating all the costs. For example, the photographer charged $5,000, but the planner told my friend it was $8,000 and pocketed the extra $3,000. She did this with every vendor: catering, flowers, rentals, you name it. By the time my friend caught on, she had lost over $40,000 in fraudulent markups. Since she never had a contract that explicitly stated that all vendor invoices had to be disclosed, the planner wasn't technically breaking any laws. She had simply negotiated on the couple's behalf and taken a huge cut. After months of stress and legal back and forth, my friend managed to recover some of the money, but the damage was done. It tainted what should have been the happiest day of her life. If she had required a transparent invoicing clause in her contract, she would have never been scammed. Story 14. This happened to my sister's friend. They booked a luxury beachside resort for their wedding, which was supposed to include an open bar, a 5-course meal, and a late-night snack service for the guests. It was not cheap, over $100,000 for everything. But here's the kicker. Their contract never explicitly listed the alcohol brands or meal portions. It just said premium liquor and gourmet dinner. On the wedding night, guests started noticing that the drinks were suspiciously weak. Turns out, the resort had been serving cheap bottom-shelf alcohol instead of the high-end brands the couple thought they were getting. And instead of a 5-course meal, guests were served tiny appetizer-sized portions that left half of them hungry by the end of the night. When the couple confronted the venue, the manager simply pointed at the contract. It never specified exact brands of alcohol or portion sizes. Legally, the resort hadn't done anything wrong. They spent thousands more trying to fix the disaster, bringing in extra food last minute and hiring a separate bartender to mix real cocktails. In the end, they lost over $30,000 just trying to salvage the night. If they had listed exact details in their contract, this wouldn't have happened. Story 15. This one is absolutely insane. A family friend booked an extravagant destination wedding in Thailand. The venue was stunning, the guest list was set, and everything seemed perfect, until the week of the wedding when the bride's dress went missing. She had shipped her $15,000 custom-made wedding dress to Thailand using a luxury courier service. The problem? The contract she signed with the courier had a liability limit of $500 for lost items. Somewhere along the way, the dress vanished. Gone. No tracking updates, no explanation. The courier company admitted they lost it but refused to compensate her beyond the $500 cap stated in their terms and conditions. The bride was devastated. With only a few days before the wedding, she had to buy an off-the-rack dress in a foreign country, spending another $8,000 just to have something halfway decent. Meanwhile, her dream dress was never recovered. If she had read the contract carefully and paid for additional insurance, she could have been fully reimbursed or used a safer shipping method. Instead, she was out $15,000 and left with a last-minute replacement dress that wasn't even close to what she had envisioned. Story 16. A couple I know planned a massive, luxurious wedding at a historic estate. It was a $200,000 affair, top-tier catering, celebrity florists, and an imported French champagne bar. The estate required them to use its in-house event staff for security, which seemed fine at first. What they didn't check was the security clause in the contract. On the wedding day, an uninvited guest slipped in, a distant ex of the groom who had heard about the event through social media. She got past security easily because There was no guest list verification requirement in the contract. She made a full scene during the reception, sobbing, knocking over champagne glasses, and trying to talk to the groom. The security team finally removed her, but the damage was done. Guests were rattled, the couple was embarrassed, and some people left early. When the couple confronted the venue, they were told, "We provided security as agreed, removal only upon escalation." Since there was no clause stating security needed to check IDs or verify guest lists, they had no legal grounds for a refund. A simple addition to the contract: security must enforce a verified guest list and actively monitor for intruders, could have saved them from this nightmare. Instead, they paid $200,000 for a wedding they'll always remember for the wrong reason. Story 17. My friend's sister had a destination wedding in the Caribbean. The couple booked a private beach resort for a weekend-long celebration, dropping over $80,000 on the venue alone. The contract looked solid until they arrived and discovered a giant music festival happening next door. The contract didn't include an exclusivity clause regarding noise levels. So while the couple envisioned a romantic beachfront ceremony with gentle ocean waves in the background, what they got was pounding bass, drunken festival goers shouting nearby, and techno music so loud it vibrated the champagne flutes on the reception tables. The resort manager just shrugged and said, "Sorry, we don't control what happens outside our property." And technically, they weren't wrong. Nowhere in the contract did it say the venue was responsible for external disturbances. In the end, the couple spent an extra $20,000 moving their ceremony indoors at the last minute, renting additional sound equipment just to try to drown out the music. If they had negotiated a noise policy or ensured exclusivity in the contract, they could have saved themselves a massive headache and their money. Story 18. My cousin's wedding disaster came down to one missing contract clause: vendor substitution approval. She had booked a high-end floral designer for $15,000. Her contract detailed the types of flowers she wanted: peonies, garden roses, and orchids. But what she didn't include was a clause stating she had to approve any last-minute substitutions. The wedding day arrives, and instead of the elegant pastel floral arrangements she envisioned, she walks into the venue to find bright orange and red carnations. Turns out there had been a supplier issue, and the florist had swapped the flowers last minute. Because the contract only loosely outlined the floral selection without requiring her approval for changes, she had zero say in the matter. The photos looked nothing like what she had planned. She tried to demand a refund, but the florist pointed to the contract, which simply stated high-quality seasonal florals. Legally, they weren't in the wrong. She ended up spending another $7,000 that day on emergency flowers to try and salvage the day. If she had added a vendor substitution approval clause, this never would have happened. Story 19. One of the worst wedding disasters I've ever heard was my friend's catering catastrophe. They had hired a high-end caterer for their 300-person wedding, with a menu that included filet mignon, lobster, and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Total cost? Around $45,000. But on the day of the wedding, the food arrived ice cold. Turns out, the contract didn't include delivery and setup specifications. The caterer technically provided the meals, but they dropped everything off hours before the event and left. There was no staff on site to heat or serve the food. Guests ended up with lukewarm steak, rubbery lobster, and barely thawed shrimp cocktails. The couple tried to demand a refund, but the caterer pointed to the contract, which only specified meal quality and ingredients, not temperature or service times. They had to spend thousands hiring an emergency team to reheat and serve the food. It was a logistical nightmare, and the couple spent the reception stressed out instead of enjoying their big day. If they had clearly outlined delivery, setup, and serving expectations in the contract, this wouldn't have happened. Story 20. This one is unbelievable. A friend of mine had a lavish wedding at a luxury downtown hotel. The wedding package included a honeymoon suite for the newlyweds. Sounds great, right? Well, they never checked the fine print on the room reservation policy. The night of the wedding, after an incredible reception, the bride and groom arrived at their honeymoon suite only to find it occupied. Another hotel guest had been mistakenly assigned their room earlier in the day. And since the contract didn't explicitly state that the hotel had to hold the suite past check-in time, the front desk gave it away to someone else. The hotel was fully booked due to a convention, so there were 0 available rooms left. The newlyweds ended up spending their wedding night sleeping on a pull-out couch in a cramped conference room because that was all the hotel could offer. The hotel manager apologized but refused to compensate them, citing the contract's vague wording about accommodations subject to availability. Had they insisted on a clause that guaranteed the room, they would have avoided spending their first night as a married couple in a makeshift hotel office. Story 21. A family friend had a lavish $250,000 wedding planned at a five-star resort. The contract covered almost everything: catering, decor, photography. But there was one tiny mistake that cost them big. They assumed the venue would provide power backups for the outdoor event. The ceremony started at sunset, the lights were strung up, the DJ was ready to go, and then, boom, a full power out. Turns out the venue had no emergency generators. The entire wedding was left in complete darkness except for a few phone flashlights. The DJ couldn't play music, the caterers couldn't heat the food, and the guests were sweating because the AC shut off. The venue refused to take responsibility, saying, "Power failures are not within our control." Since the contract didn't explicitly require them to provide backup power, the couple was out of luck. They had to spend an additional $20,000 the next day hosting a second reception just to make up for the ruined night. A simple clause about power contingencies could have saved them hundreds of thousands and their dream wedding. Story 22. My cousin's wedding disaster was entirely preventable. They booked a luxury yacht for their reception, a floating party with gourmet food, an open bar, and a live jazz band. They signed the contract without checking the fine print. What they didn't see? A strict guest weight limit. On the day of the wedding, guests boarded as planned. But as soon as the boat started moving, the crew realized they were over capacity. The yacht's stability was compromised. The captain immediately ordered a return to shore and canceled the entire trip. Because of the weight violation, the company refused any refund. The couple lost $50,000 and had to scramble for a last-minute venue to continue the reception. Guests ended up eating cold sandwiches in a rented conference hall instead of enjoying a sunset cruise. Had they clarified the weight restrictions in the contract, they could have adjusted the guest list and avoided the disaster. Instead, they paid luxury prices for a wedding that never even left the dock. Story 23. My best friend spent years planning her wedding. She found the perfect venue, an elegant, historic mansion that cost $80,000 to rent for the weekend. But she made one fatal mistake. She didn't include a construction clause in the contract. A week before the wedding, she visited the venue to finalize details, only to find scaffolding everywhere. The entire front entrance was under renovation, complete with loud drilling, construction dust, and blocked pathways. The venue never told her about the ongoing work because, legally, they weren't required to. The contract only guaranteed access to the ballroom, and technically, that part was untouched. On the wedding day, guests had to walk through a maze of scaffolding just to enter. Photos were ruined by the ugly construction in the background. The reception was constantly interrupted by hammering sounds. The venue refused a refund, citing that the contract had no clauses regarding aesthetic or construction concerns. She lost $80,000 on a wedding that looked like it was held in the middle of a renovation project. If she had added a clause requiring the venue to disclose any construction work, she could have switched locations and saved the wedding. Story 24. One of the worst wedding disasters I've ever seen happened to my coworker. They hired an expensive catering company, $60,000 for a full-course meal, waitstaff, and bar service. But nowhere in the contract did it specify who was responsible for food safety. On the wedding day, everything seemed fine. Until 2 hours in, guests started getting violently sick. Turns out, the catering company had left seafood platters sitting in the sun for hours before serving. By the end of the night, half the wedding party was either throwing up or rushed to the ER for food poisoning. The bride and groom? They spent their honeymoon in the hospital. The worst part? The caterer denied all responsibility, claiming that once the food was delivered, the venue was supposed to monitor storage conditions. Because the contract didn't clearly state food safety procedures or liability, the couple couldn't sue for damages. They ended up losing tens of thousands in medical bills and legal fees, all because they assumed high-end catering meant basic food safety. Story 25. My sister's wedding disaster was caused by one overlooked contract clause: weather contingency plans. She booked an insanely expensive outdoor vineyard wedding, $150,000 for a stunning, open-air event under the stars. The contract mentioned a backup tent, but it didn't specify the quality of that backup plan. The wedding day arrives and a freak rainstorm hits hard. The venue scrambled to set up their backup tent, which turned out to be a flimsy party rental that barely covered half the guests. Rain poured in from the sides. The wooden dance floor became a slip and slide. Guests were drenched, and the catering staff had to serve food in soaking wet conditions. The cake collapsed from humidity before they even cut it. The venue refused a refund, pointing to the contract, which only vaguely mentioned a tent, without promising it would be functional. She had to spend an extra $30,000 last-minute renting emergency tents and heaters just to keep the reception from becoming a complete washout. If she had clarified the weather backup plan in writing, she could have saved thousands and avoided a wedding where guests left shivering and soaking wet. Story 26. My friend booked a luxury mansion wedding for $75,000 with an all-inclusive package, catering, florals, and decor. The venue's contract seemed airtight. But one thing wasn't in writing: parking and transportation for guests. On the day of the wedding, guests arrived to find no parking available. The venue was in a residential neighborhood with strict parking regulations, and apparently, the mansion's tiny lot only fit 10 cars for a 200-person wedding. Panicked, guests started parking in nearby streets. Big mistake. The police arrived mid-ceremony and started towing cars left and right. Guests had to leave the wedding to deal with impound fees, and the couple was hit with multiple noise complaints due to the chaos outside. When they confronted the venue, they were told, "We never guaranteed guest parking." Sure enough, there was no mention of parking accommodations in the contract. They ended up shelling out $15,000 for emergency shuttles and reimbursing guests hundreds in towing fees. If they had included a parking clause in their contract, they could have avoided an entire wedding reception turning into a parking dispute. Story 27. A couple I know hired a renowned wedding cake designer for their big day. A $6,000 custom cake designed to look like an elegant cascading floral arrangement. The contract listed flavors and premium design, but it never included a final image of what they were paying. The day of the wedding, they walked into the reception to find a disaster. Instead of an elegant, towering masterpiece, the cake looked lopsided, melted, and covered in cheap plastic flowers. Worse, it was the wrong flavor. They immediately called the bakery, but the owner shrugged it off, saying they'd had a last-minute staffing issue and had to improvise the design. Since the contract didn't specifically state the cake's dimensions or decorations, they had no way to demand a refund. They ended up spending an extra $1,000 on a last-minute replacement cake from a grocery just so they had something for the cake-cutting ceremony. If they had attached detailed design specifications to the contract, they wouldn't have been scammed out of thousands for what looked like a school bake sale project. Story 28. A groom I know lost $20,000 due to one missing contract clause: a vendor cancellation policy. They had booked a famous videographer for a high-end cinematic wedding film. Everything was set, and they even paid half up front as a deposit. The contract seemed solid, except it never outlined what would happen if the videographer bailed. 2 days before the wedding, the videographer canceled. No explanation, just an email saying they had to drop out. The couple was devastated. They tried to get their money back, but the videographer pointed to the contract, which didn't have a refund clause for vendor cancellations. Legally, he was in the... With 48 hours to go, they had to scramble and hire another videographer for double the price, $15,000 instead of $7,000, because it was such short notice. Had they included a vendor cancellation clause, they could have either gotten a full refund or forced the videographer to provide a backup professional. Instead, they paid twice the price for a wedding video that wasn't even what they originally wanted. Story 29. This happened to my boss's niece. She planned a destination wedding in Mexico, spending over $100,000 on an all-inclusive resort. The couple thought everything was perfect, but they never read the fine print on the guest accommodation block in the contract. Turns out, the resort overbooked. When guests started arriving, half of them were turned away and told there were no available rooms. Some were sent to a different hotel 20 minutes away, while others were given rooms that were under construction. Instead of celebrating their wedding, the bride and groom spent the night arguing with hotel staff and trying to find rooms for their family members. The resort refused to refund guests who were sent elsewhere, citing a first-come, first-serve policy, which was in the contract, hidden in the fine print. They had to shell out $15,000 of their own money to rebook rooms last minute. Had they included a clause guaranteeing guest accommodations, they wouldn't have had to spend their wedding night handling hotel disputes instead of celebrating. Story 30. A friend of mine booked an outdoor estate wedding in California, spending nearly $200,000 on what was supposed to be an elegant garden ceremony. The contract covered every florals, seating, music, except one major thing: insect control. The week before the wedding, a freak heatwave hit, and with it came a massive wasp infestation. The venue was located near a wooded area, and the sudden heat caused hundreds of wasps to swarm the property. By the time the ceremony started, guests were dodging wasps left and right. Several people got stung, including the bride's grandmother, who was allergic and had to be rushed to the ER. The venue refused a refund, saying pest control was not included in the wedding pack. Since the contract didn't specify any guarantee of insect management, they had no legal recourse. They spent another $10,000 on emergency exterminators mid-wedding and had to move the reception indoors, which ruined all the decor and setup. Had they added a pest control clause in the contract, the venue would have been responsible for treating the area before the wedding. Instead, they paid six figures for a wedding that turned into a real-life wasp nightmare. Story 31. A couple I know lost over $50,000 because they assumed the venue would handle permits for their outdoor wedding. They booked a cliffside estate overlooking the ocean, stunning views, gorgeous architecture, and a luxury price tag. The contract covered catering, decor, and guest accommodations, but it never specified who was responsible for securing event permits. The night before the wedding, the estate's security team shut everything down. Turns out the venue never applied for a noise permit, and local regulations prohibited amplified music after 8 p.m. With no DJ, no speeches, and no first dance, the couple had to scrap the entire evening reception. Instead of celebrating, guests sat around in awkward silence, eating dinner with no music. The venue refused to offer a refund, citing that permits were the couple's responsibility. Since it wasn't explicitly stated in the contract, the couple had no legal. They ended up spending another $20,000 relocating the afterparty to a last-minute event space just to salvage the night. If they had included a clause stating the venue must handle all necessary permits, this never would have happened. Story 32. A friend of mine hired a high-end photographer for her wedding, $12,000 for a cinematic-style photo package. She assumed the contract covered everything, but it was missing one crucial detail: a delivery deadline. After the wedding, she waited and waited. Months passed. The photographer ghosted her. Finally, a year later, she tracked them down. They sent her a rushed, sloppy album full of overexposed, out-of-focus shots. Worse, many important moments were missing. No first dance, no family portraits. She demanded a refund, but since the contract never specified when the photos had to be delivered or their quality standards, the photographer was legally covered. She had to hire another editor for $3,000 to salvage what little she could from the raw files. Had she included a clause with a strict deadline and quality standards, she could have either gotten her money back or forced the photographer to redo the job properly. Story 33. This $80,000 wedding disaster happened because the couple trusted a handshake deal instead of a contract. They hired an event decorator to create a custom floral wall, intricate table settings, and a dramatic ceiling installation. It was a high-end design job, and they paid $25,000 upfront. The decorator vanished 2 weeks before the wedding. No responses. No explanations. Gone. Since they never signed a formal contract, there was no way to take legal action. They tried to book another decorator last minute, but since everything was custom ordered, it was impossible to replicate. They ended up scrambling for DIY decorations, and their high-end wedding looked nothing like what they had envisioned. The decorator resurfaced 6 months later, claiming a family emergency. Too late. They were out $25,000 with no recourse. Had they signed a contract with refund and cancellation policies, they could have forced the decorator to return their money or provide a backup vendor. Story 34. A couple lost $30,000 because their wedding literally melted. They planned a gorgeous summer wedding at a vineyard, with an ice sculpture centerpiece, a delicate buttercream cake, and a chocolate fountain for dessert. The contract outlined food and decor, but it never included temperature control requirements. A heat wave hit. 107 degrees Fahrenheit on the wedding day. The ice sculpture? A puddle before guests even arrived. The buttercream cake? A melted mess. The chocolate fountain? Turned into a sludge disaster. The caterer refused responsibility, pointing out that temperature issues weren't covered in the contract. They had to spend $10,000 on an emergency cake replacement and more on last-minute tents and fans to stop the rest of the wedding from becoming a sweaty disaster. Had they included a clause requiring temperature-controlled setups, they could have avoided losing thousands to melting decorations. Story 35. My coworker's sister lost $60,000 because she didn't insist on an exclusivity clause with the venue. She booked a high-end hotel ballroom for her dream wedding, assuming she'd have the space to herself. On the wedding day, she walked in to discover another wedding happening right next door. Not just any wedding, a massive, over-the-top cultural wedding with a 10-piece brass band. The music was so loud that their officiant had to shout during the vows. The couple couldn't hear their own speeches, and the dance floor literally vibrated from the music next door. When they complained, the venue refused to do anything, pointing to the fine print in the contract, which never guaranteed full exclusivity. They tried to negotiate a refund, but the venue refused, citing that multiple events are common at peak times. They ended up spending $20,000 on soundproofing and speakers just to be heard, but the night was already ruined. Had they added a no competing events clause, they could have secured a private space or at least gotten a partial refund. Story 36. A friend of mine lost $35,000 because her venue double-booked her wedding date. She had booked a gorgeous private vineyard estate and assumed she'd have the entire place to herself. The contract confirmed the date, but didn't specify exclusivity. On the wedding day, she arrived to find another couple having their wedding on the same property. Not just a small elopement, a full-blown event with a live band, fireworks, and hundreds of guests. The ceremony was drowned out by loud music. The photo spots were crowded with strangers, and guests kept wandering into the wrong reception. When she complained, the venue manager simply said, the contract never guaranteed exclusivity. Since there was no clause protecting her, she had no legal way to get a refund. She had to spend $10,000 relocating her reception indoors just to escape the noise. Had she included an exclusivity clause in the contract, she could have avoided sharing her wedding with total strangers. Story 37. My cousin spent $50,000 on catering, only for half her guests to never get their meals. She hired a prestigious catering company with a contract that included a per-person plated meal service. What it didn't include was staffing guarantees. On the wedding night, the servers were severely understaffed. Plates took so long to be delivered that some guests never even received their food. The bride's parents and multiple VIP guests ended up eating nothing but appetizers. When they confronted the caterer, they refused responsibility, saying their contract only promised food, not service speed. The couple had to refund guests out of their own pocket and hire a last-minute late-night pizza delivery just to make sure people had something to eat. A simple clause ensuring a set number of servers per guest would have saved them tens of thousands of dollars and a whole lot of embarrassment. Story 38. A high school friend of mine booked a $70,000 beachfront wedding and thought she covered all the details. The contract included a rain contingency plan, but it didn't specify when they had to make the call. On the day of the wedding, storm clouds started rolling in an hour before the ceremony. The venue insisted on waiting until the last possible minute to decide whether to move indoors. When the rain finally hit, it was too late to set up the backup. Guests got soaked, the decorations were ruined, and the DJ's equipment short-circuited. The reception had to be cut short because the tables and chairs were drenched. Since the contract never specified a clear timeline for weather decisions, the venue denied any responsibility. The couple had to spend $15,000 on last-minute tent rentals and extra cleanup costs. If they had included a clear weather contingency clause, they could have avoided the entire disaster. Story 39. A couple I know spent $90,000 on a luxury wedding at a high-end hotel ballroom. Their contract seemed thorough, except for one missing detail: renovation clauses. A month before the wedding, they arrived for a final walkthrough and found the entire lobby under construction. There were plastic tarps, scaffolding, and loud jackhammers. The hotel assured them the renovations wouldn't affect their event, but on the wedding day, construction noise could be heard throughout the ceremony. Worse, their ballroom entrance was blocked by caution tape, and guests had to take a service elevator to get in. When they demanded a refund, the hotel pointed out that the contract never guaranteed the venue's aesthetic condition. They ended up spending an extra $20,000 on last-minute decor and rented draping just to cover up the mess. A simple clause guaranteeing no construction or aesthetic disruptions would have saved them tens of thousands. Story 40. A friend's $120,000 wedding turned into a lawsuit because the wedding planner disappeared with the money. The couple hired a luxury wedding planner who promised to handle everything: vendors, decor, and logistics. They paid her $60,000 upfront. 2 months before the wedding, she vanished. She stopped responding to emails, deleted her business website, and ghosted all communication. The couple panicked and tried contacting vendors, only to find out she had never actually booked anything. They had to scramble to replan everything with only weeks to go, spending another $50,000 on last-minute services. They tried to sue, but since the contract didn't specify where the money was going, it was hard to prove fraud. The planner claimed she had already spent the funds on planning fees. Had they included a financial transparency clause requiring detailed receipts for every vendor payment, they could have caught the scam early before losing their money. Story 41. A couple I know spent $150,000 on a destination wedding in Bali, expecting a luxury experience for their guests. Their contract with the resort seemed perfect, until they realized it didn't include a clause about food restrictions. The bride's entire family was vegetarian, and they had specifically requested an all-vegetarian menu. The resort verbally agreed, but it was never put in writing. On the wedding day, the buffet was filled with meat dishes. Guests were furious. and some refused to eat at all. The couple confronted the resort manager, but since the contract didn't specify a fully vegetarian menu, the resort refused to offer any refunds or replacements. They had to spend an extra $20,000 on last-minute outside catering, but by the time the new food arrived, most guests had already left. Had they included a dietary restriction clause, they could have avoided spending thousands of dollars fixing a mistake that never should have happened. Story 42. My coworker's sister lost $40,000 because she never signed a contract for her wedding band. She had booked a 10-piece live band to perform for 5 hours at the reception, paying a $10,000 deposit up front. The band seemed professional and well-reviewed, so she didn't think she needed a formal contract. On the wedding night, only 3 musicians showed up. There was no singer, no drummer, and no backup player. The music was weak and awkward, and guests stopped dancing halfway through the night. The bride tried to demand a refund, but the band leader refused, claiming that the deposit was non-refundable and there was no contract specifying the number of musicians required. She ended up paying another $5,000 for an emergency DJ just to save the night. But it was too late. The energy was already ruined. Had she insisted on a contract specifying the full band lineup, she could have avoided one of the biggest disappointments of her life. Story 43. A bride I know had her $60,000 wedding cake destroyed because she didn't read the fine print on the venue's vendor policy. She had ordered a massive 6-tier luxury cake from a famous baker in New York. The contract included the delivery date and setup instructions, but what she didn't check was the venue's refrigeration policy. The cake was delivered 4 hours before the wedding, but since the venue didn't allow outside vendors to use their refrigeration units, the cake was left sitting out in the sun. By the time the reception started, the cake had collapsed into a melted pile of frosting and fondant. The venue refused responsibility, saying the contract didn't guarantee temperature-controlled storage for outside vendors. The bakery also refused a refund, stating that they delivered as agreed. The bride had to spend an extra $8,000 on a last-minute replacement cake, and her dream wedding dessert was ruined. A simple clause ensuring proper refrigeration for outside vendors could have saved her tens of thousands of dollars. Story 44. One of the most expensive wedding disasters I've ever heard involved a private island ceremony that turned into a nightmare. A wealthy couple spent over $500,000 booking an exclusive island resort for a week-long wedding celebration. Their contract covered luxury accommodations, catering, and entertainment, but it never specified emergency transportation options. 2 days before the wedding, a tropical storm hit. Flights were grounded, ferries were canceled, and half the guests, including the groom's parents, were stranded on the mainland. With no emergency transport plan in place, the couple had to charter private helicopters at $10,000 per trip just to get guests to the island. They spent over $75,000 on last-minute flights and boat rentals just to make sure people could actually attend. Had they included a contingency plan in the contract, the resort could have been responsible for alternative transport. Instead, they paid a small fortune just to avoid an empty wedding. Story 45. A close friend of mine had a $90,000 wedding ruined because her wedding planner never confirmed the rental agreement for the chairs and tables. The couple assumed the planner had handled everything, but on the wedding day, they arrived to find an empty reception hall. No chairs, no tables, no dinner setup. The rental company had no record of the order because the planner never officially signed the contract. The venue had nothing available and it was too late to book another company. Guests ended up standing for most of the reception, eating their meals on their laps because there were no tables or chairs. The couple tried to sue the planner, but since the contract didn't include vendor accountability, there was no way to prove negligence. Had they included a clause requiring written confirmations for all rentals, they could have avoided one of the biggest logistical disasters imaginable. Story 46. My friend's $120,000 wedding was ruined because the venue didn't have working air conditioning. She booked a historic ballroom with massive chandeliers, beautiful architecture, and a contract that covered everything, except climate control. The wedding day arrived, and it was a brutal 95 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The ballroom, built in the 1800s, had no central AC, and the small portable fans weren't enough. Guests were sweating through their formal wear, the bride's makeup melted, and 2 elderly guests passed out from heat exhaustion. The cake started drooping, and the flowers wilted before dinner was even served. The couple tried to demand a refund, but the venue pointed to the contract, which never guaranteed air conditioning. They ended up spending $15,000 on last-minute industrial fans and bottled water. But by then, half the guests had already left. Had they added a temperature control clause, they could have avoided a wedding that felt more like a sauna.